Alright, guys, so everything is going off the rails. Russia has had enough. This conflict has been going on for over 2 years. The West has thrown all their spaghetti on the wall. They have seized the frozen assets. They tried cutting Russia away from SWIFT, and they are bankrolling Ukraine. But funding a conflict is extremely expensive, which is the Achilles heel of the West. The longer this drags on, the closer the G7 comes towards a debt implosion and or a recession. And here's how serious the situation is. We are in really crazy town now. Just last year, US interest payments reached an insane $1 trillion a year. If this continues, interest of the debt will cost more than Medicare. The 2020 stimulus checks pushed the debt higher. However, the Ukraine war triggered even more government spending and the issuance of bonds. By the time we reach a peace agreement, the yearly burden could easily reach $2 trillion a year. Now, if you're Russia, you want to make the conflict as costly as possible for the G7. You want to squeeze both their economies and their militaries at the same time. And to do that, you throw down your ace in the hole, which is cutting away critical commodity supplies. Putin is now telling the government to curb exports of key materials to the West, and this includes nickel, uranium, and titanium. These are critical inputs that fuel the G7 economies and the war effort. Now, we have reached the point where Putin is counterattacking not just on the ground in Kursk, but in the global economy as well. He's weaponizing Russia's vast stockpiles of natural resources. Russia is the leader in strategic raw materials reserves like uranium, titanium, and nickel. Since they limit our exports, we should also think about restrictions. So the battle is about to get much more expensive for the West. Russia is a big supplier of all these commodities, and when supply gets restricted, prices goes up, especially when you have a commanding control in the market. Putin is challenging Yellen's claims that the US economy can afford multiple wars. He wants to call her bluff at the poker table.
This is the most threatening and challenging geopolitical environment that I've ever seen. At the same time, the US is in its weakest fiscal position since World War II, with debt to GDP at 122%. Can America, can the West afford another war at this time?
I think the answer is absolutely. America can certainly afford to stand with Israel and to support Israel's military needs. And we also can and must support Ukraine in its struggle against Russia.
So the playbook here is very simple but yet very effective. And let's just focus on nickel. Almost immediately after Putin's threat, the price soared by 3%. A shortage might be coming really soon. Back in March, the LME blocked Russia's nickel from entering. When that happened, it cut away a huge amount of supply. Russia accounted for 36% of nickel stockpiles in the Western exchange. This was a crazy move. End users, they now have to scramble around the world to source for nickel. Producers, they see this and they are ready to take their pound of flesh. They will jack prices higher because they simply can. Now that Putin wants to restrict supply directly from the source, this will make Western importers even more desperate. Nickel is about to get a whole lot more expensive. Firstly, the US has a nickel shortage, and this is bad because nickel is a dual use mineral. It's used in making batteries in the EV sector, we all know that, but it's also needed to make corrosion resistant armor plating. America's primary nickel mine is about to close next year in 2025. So supply has to be imported from overseas, and that drives expenses up. Russia is also the third biggest exporter of nickel in the world, selling almost $3 billion worth. Now, this supply can always get rerouted to China to make EVs instead of selling it to the West. What does it do? It benefits Beijing, but this is a big headache to Washington. This will ramp up the economic pain on Yellen's two-front war. Battling Russia is a completely different situation that the West isn't prepared for. They are a commodity giant that controls global supply chains. If your inputs fly to the sky, eventually you'll be forced to choose between securing your industries or waging an endless war. It's not a coincidence that Russia is targeting materials like nickel and uranium. Now, both of them are facing big supply risks in the US economy. According to the US Department of Energy, uranium and nickel, they are of high importance. Over the next 10 years, the US can face a big supply shock that would be devastating. There has been a big underinvestment in supply chains, and reality is starting to catch up with the West. Uranium is also a very big dual use material that the US buys from Russia using a waiver. Uranium is used to run nuclear power plants. That is the common knowledge of its usage. But they also have a military application to it as well. Depleted uranium is a byproduct that can be used to sharpen projectiles and make them extra deadly. And these depleted munitions are already being sent to Ukraine. If you're Russia, you know that the conflict isn't going to end anytime soon. After the disastrous election debate, Kamala Harris has confirmed her stance on the war. And surprisingly, she's very hawkish on Russia, which means the conflict is going to drag on, and on.
And what we have done to preserve the ability of Zelensky and the Ukrainians to fight for their independence. Otherwise, Putin would be sitting in Kyiv with his eyes on the rest of Europe, starting with Poland. And why don't you tell the 800,000 Polish Americans right here in Pennsylvania how quickly you would give up for the sake of favor and what you think is a friendship with what is known to be a dictator who would eat you for lunch.
If this doesn't sound hawkish, nothing will. This means if Kamala gets into office, the US would most certainly ramp up support. More money will be raised and spending will explode. Now, Putin isn't blind, he can see this coming from a mile away. Russia can't stop the White House from funding Ukraine, but it can definitely make it riskier for the US financial system.
The U.S. is on an unsustainable fiscal path. The U.S. federal government's on an unsustainable fiscal path. And that just means that the debt is growing faster than the economy.
I have the sense this worries you very much.
Over the long run, of course it does. You know, we're borrowing from future generations. It's time for us to get back to putting a priority on fiscal sustainability.
Even the Fed knows that the jig is coming to an end. The more expensive Russia can make the war, the more Harris will have to spend and the bigger the federal deficits will be. Now, you know it's bad when even Wall Street is sounding the alarm bells. Bank of America is telling Congress to cut down on the national debt. Interest payments alone are $1 trillion a year or $3 billion a day. How is that even sustainable? While US interest rates are going to come down, that doesn't mean you can borrow money endlessly. The snowball effect is going to catch up on your economy sooner or later. This chart from JP Morgan is terrifying. This is the prelude to a financial apocalypse and economic Armageddon. By 2054, US deficit spending will hit 8% of GDP. Just to keep the system running, the Treasury will have to borrow almost a tenth of US economic output. This is going to push the debt to unthinkable levels. The interest payments alone are already higher than the original amount of deficits, and this is called the snowball effect. At this trajectory, the US will have to either default on the debt or print trillions and debase the currency. A prolonged conflict would only accelerate the process. So the longer the war continues, the closer we get towards an irreversible crisis. To fight Russia, the US is risking the entire debt market and by extension, the US economy as a whole. Now the gamble is simple. Can we defeat the Russians fast enough? Or could we outlast them financially? Now we know winning on the ground is quite far-fetched at this point. From an economic perspective, it's also quite a stretch to say Russia's economy will collapse tomorrow. It's much more resilient than what the West thinks. Putin's ministers, they are forecasting a rosy outlook for Russia's economy. From today until 2030, GDP will continue to grow. Productivity is also going to rise higher, exceeding historical benchmarks. Now, these are ambitious goals for sure, but if it comes true, it means Russia's economic growth will remain strong, even stronger than the EU or even the US. And here are the targets. Inflation in Russia to fall by 4% by 2026. By 2030, they will still have a GDP growth of 3.2% and capital investment will grow by over 4%. Retail sales will also go up by 3.6%. Now, all of these are government figures, so yeah, take them with a pinch of salt. But if Putin's government is right, the West will be fighting for many years to come. Russia won't suddenly collapse tomorrow if Kamala gets in and commits fully. The national debt will explode. And even if they use the frozen reserves, the $300 billion will run out eventually. This is a finite amount of money. We can prepare for higher deficits and increase government spending. If you thought this was bad, well, things can always escalate even further. Russia ramping up export controls will hurt, but the West is about to go off the rails again. The US is warning their EU allies that China is now backing Russia's war economy. And this is a very dangerous statement that could be a prelude to new crazy sanctions. Sanctions that apply pressure on the Chinese banking systems, that, as we all know, will be unthinkable.
One is we've already sanctioned more than 100 Chinese entities that we've identified that were engaged in providing dual-use products, other things that are on sanctions lists. We will continue to do that. And we're working to coordinate our efforts with European and other partners who are also aggrieved, in fact, in many ways, even more aggrieved by this practice because it's a direct threat to them.
Now, Blinken has made it very clear the US declaring China backing Russia's war economy means even more sanctions are coming. Yellen also said before that the banking system could be nixed. These aren't conspiracy theories, they're all over mainstream media. So the economic war could be ramping up to new untold levels. Not good for anyone, however, there's probably no U-turn left. But let me know what you think. Will Russia cut away critical exports to the West? Will the US really go after China next? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.